Good morning, English 20. I wanted to give some final thoughts on the conclusion in Motomura's book, Americans in Waiting. And so I've created this PowerPoint to give some of the points that I would have pointed out during class. So I think in the conclusion, Motomura does a good job of summarizing and revisiting his main question that he started with, which was, what does it mean to be a nation of immigrants? He says he's tried to answer this question by looking at how the U.S. treats lawful immigrants. And he says we can kind of gauge our treatment by looking at how we treat newcomers, how we guard our borders, how we choose who can become an immigrant, and especially how we treat lawful immigrants is important because they are the non-citizens who are closest to being citizens, and he feels that looking at them tells the most about how we're treating immigrants and how we can answer this particular question, which I think he has pointed that out maybe throughout the book as he's given the various examples historically about how we've treated immigrants and bringing us up to the present day or present day of the book. He also brings back up the idea that he started with, that our commitment to equality as a nation is evident in the Brown versus Board of Education statute. And he says that this idea of equality is important for an analysis of immigration and citizenship. And equality is really the line between who's an insider or a citizen and who's an outsider. And so he brings back up both of those ideas that he started with in the introduction here as he ends. He again summarizes and revisits the attitudes and approaches to immigration that are used in the United States, and the ideas that we've been working with all semester, immigration as contract and immigration as affiliation, he says are conventional attitudes about immigration. He says that immigration as contract reflects the notion that we can achieve fair and just outcomes without equality for non-citizens, as long as we respect other values such as notice and protection of expectations. In other words, if we respect the contract, then we can achieve fairness despite the fact that we may be treating non-citizens in an unequal way. He elaborates again on immigration as affiliation and says that this lets lawful immigrants earn an approximation of equality as they gradually form ties in the U.S. But he goes on to say that some people may overgeneralize these views of immigration and see immigration as contract as being less welcoming to immigrants and affiliation as more welcoming. But he says this is too simplistic. He points out that contract can protect non-citizens, and I think we have seen this in some of the earlier chapters where the contractual agreements with immigrants provided some protection for them. And he says affiliation can be less welcoming for new immigrants because with affiliation you have to be here for a certain amount of time and create ties, and so new immigrants won't be welcomed under affiliation. And so here's where he says that view of both of these as contract as bad, affiliation as good is a little bit too simplistic. And his ultimate conclusion is that neither of these approaches treats immigrants as if they will become citizens. And this is why he's suggesting the third view, immigration as transition to citizenship, or this idea of Americans in waiting. In terms of immigration as transition, I think in chapter 10 we saw him flesh out the arguments for this. And here in the conclusion, he just simply summarizes what he's been telling us throughout the book and what he ultimately lays out in chapter 10 as a way toward immigration as transition. He explains again that transition was once in history the norm for immigration, but this was during a time when immigration law was used to define who could be an American, and that was mainly certain white European immigrants. And so race or ethnicity was used to keep some people from citizenship. He talks about as immigration and citizenship became more open, we lost this attitude of immigration as transition and became less welcoming to immigrants. And he is advocating to regain this idea of immigration as transition, but says we would need to do the following. And these are things that he lays out clearly in chapter 10, but I'll recap them here. He wants to remove obstacles to naturalization and treat that time period to naturalization as an opportunity to help these newcomers integrate into the U.S. society. He also says that changes to current law would be required so that these immigrants could be like citizens in the following areas, and he mentions family reunification, public education, public assistance, voting, and public employment. And then the last point is that their exposure for deportation would be limited to only serious crimes. So other minor crimes, they would be treated as other citizens and have whatever punishment would be deemed appropriate. So again, this recaps the information that he laid out in more detail in chapter 10. And then at the end of the conclusion, he comes back to 3 ideas from the beginning of the book and says these are important to look at in terms of what the book covers and what he's suggesting. One is the role of law, and he says law serves as a steering mechanism that creates the basic conditions for integration, but we need laws that don't involve so much government intervention and instead create conditions for communities to make immigrants feel welcome. So here, I think he's indicating that the laws may steer and guide us, but communities in the U.S. Need to be more involved in welcoming immigrants. The second thing he notes is the shift from state to federal law that occurred, and we saw that as he gives historical information about immigration law in the book. And he reiterates that immigrants are a federal responsibility. I think this is similar to arguments that Smith makes in his paper that we read earlier and completed the rhetorical analysis on. Smith talks about the burdens of immigration falling on particular states and feels that the federal government should help with that. And I think that Motomura also feels similarly that immigration and immigrants are a federal responsibility. But we go back to this idea that federal law is a steering mechanism, and so ultimately the states will be involved, but maybe federal financing and federal guidance would guide this process. The third idea that he brings back up is that citizenship in the U.S. can create a sense of belonging and participation in civic, political, social, and economic life in the U.S. And I think this is ultimately what he hopes for in terms of immigrants, rather than them being isolated, that they are adding to the culture in the U.S. and creating something more, as opposed to just assimilating to U.S. culture and giving up their culture, but becoming a contributor to U.S. culture and bringing with it their ideas. His final thought is that this idea of Americans in waiting is about a welcome for immigrants that helps them to freely think for themselves and make this choice to be an American. And so I think ultimately what he's saying is that this idea of Americans in waiting is still a very American sort of attitude toward immigration. Immigrants should be encouraged to be free-thinking Americans like those that are already here, and should make this choice. I've also added some links on here to additional videos where the author himself is speaking, so you can see some of his thoughts and ideas in his own words. The first one is an interview with the author, which is I think about a half-hour long, so you may not want to watch the whole thing, but she does bring up Americans in Waiting in the first few moments of the video. The second one, he's talking about DACA and responding to questions, and this one's fairly short. And then the last one is an hour-long lecture that he gave about immigration law. So I hope that kind of wraps up Motomura's final thoughts and the conclusions. I also wanted to talk to you about some work on the research paper that you're working on, and I'm going to make a second video to talk specifically about that. Thanks.